Friends, postpartum is spooky. When a woman gives birth, the few months after or even before are critical to her mental well being. I'm going to start with the case of Alice Mackey, who suffered from such psychosis. In fact, in my family, we're expecting twins in November. And I know right now and after, the mental stability of my wife is going to be crucial to her ongoing recovery. And that's why I decided to focus on this case. And then after this, I'm going to tell you about the case of Morgan Kiely, who literally had her child pass away and she served 0 jail time. So stay tuned for that one. Born on February 22nd, 1983, Alice Mackey was an exemplary person. She had no criminal history, no record of violence, and was known as a warm professional and highly capable individual. Her career in education spanned over 14 years, and she wasn't just any teacher, she was exceptional at what she did. Now, from September 2007 until she took maternity leave in January 2021, she taught at a school in London. But she didn't just teach, she rose through the ranks, taking on leadership roles as head of year. From the English department to writing the curriculum, she became the principal. Her personnel files paint a picture of someone with a natural affinity for children and a genuine gift for education. During her training, she was praised for her warm manner and good rapport with children. In June 2018, her head teacher wrote a glowing endorsement for a promotion application, but then Alice eventually resigned after maternity leave. Her resignation was accepted with deep regret. This is important context because it shows us who Alice was before tragedy struck. She was a competent, warm, engaged, and deeply committed woman to the welfare of children. But remember this, because the contrast of what came later is significant. Context is key. Alice was married to Peter Mackey, who worked in IT sales. The couple had previously lived in London but moved to Hampshire in 2020, settling into a semi-detached house on 2 Sandrock cottages in the small village of Kingsley. The house sat at the edge of the village, directly opposite Kingsley Common, a large area of woods and heathland. Within this common was Kingsley Pond, a fishing pond located about 300 meters west of the Mackey home. It was accessible through various pathways and tracks through woods. Now, January 2021, Alice and Peter welcomed their daughter Annabel. She should have been a source of joy, and in many ways she was. Annabel was described as a delightful child who showed maturity beyond her years. She was deeply loved by her father, her grandparents, and her aunt. But for Alice, Annabel's birth triggered something catastrophic. Shortly after giving birth, Alice began to suffer from what medical experts identified as severe case postpartum psychiatric disorder, specifically a mental or behavioral disorder associated with pregnancy and childbirth. I've mentioned it before, postpartum is a real thing, and those moments after a woman gives birth, that support system she has around her is critical for the next couple of months or however long. Alice developed postpartum psychosis, an extremely serious condition that affects approximately 1 to 2 in every 1,000 women who give birth. The severity of Alice's condition became apparent. So between May 23rd and August 19th, 2021, when Annabel was just a few months old, Alice was admitted to a psychiatric inpatient at Melbury Lodge Prenatal Mother and Baby Unit. But this wasn't a voluntary admission. Alice was detained under the Mental Health Act, which means medical professionals deemed her condition so severe she required involuntary hospitalization for her own safety and the safety of others. This had to have been done with Peter's observations, and fair play to Peter for actually taking her to the doctors. After her release in August 2021, she continued to receive treatment from the community mental health team until July 2022. So we're talking about more than a year of intensive psychiatric treatment following Annabel's birth. But here's the critical point. Her mental illness did not fully resolve. Even after 14 months of treatment, healthcare workers remained concerned. They noted a marked contrast between Annabel's healthy presentation, showing no trace of neglect, and Alice's misplaced excessive anxiety about Annabel's welfare. It's like a role reversal. The child is fine, the mother is not. This disconnect between reality and Alice's perception of reality was a warning sign that her delusional thinking persisted. Alice's husband, Peter, noticed that something fundamental had changed in his wife. In his statement, he said Alice eventually returned home, but she was never the same. She seemed more distant. He shared concerns with his friends that Alice didn't seem well enough to return to work and appeared switched off or vacant. Alice's mother, who had previously worked as a health visitor and therefore had professional experience recognizing these health issues, said she seemed distant and she was off. When Alice did return to work, it wasn't the same teaching position she had before. Instead, she took a teaching assistant job. So from principal or deputy principal to a teaching assistant. Wow. She was a teacher at the same school where Annabel attended nursery, and the difference in her performance and demeanor was striking. Now, remember how I described Alice's glowing reviews from her previous school in London? Well, the head teacher at her new school observed something completely different. She lacked engagement, she appeared vacant, she never smiled. The head teacher noted Alice seemed to be very different to the person that was recommended by her previous school. It was said her demeanor was unusual, her mouth would regularly hang open, which several staff commented upon. Her resting face was unusual. She would find it difficult to get up from the floor and was not mobile. That's a bit weird. She seemed like she wasn't really there and she didn't smile. She wasn't cuddly or warm towards the children. And this is a completely different person pre-birth of her child. Something happened and it did not go away. To her credit, Alice did seek help when she was conscious. She knew she needed it. She was compliant with her medication, specifically olanzapine. This is an antipsychotic drug. She had previously been prescribed sertraline, an antidepressant, but had stopped taking it. In fact, when Alice was told she could reduce her olanzapine dosage, she chose not to because she did not feel comfortable. So you got this dynamic here where a person is suffering from mental health and she knows it. It seems like she doesn't know why and she's seeking help. I mean, in this entire situation with herself and Peter, it seems like they're doing the best they can, which isn't often in these types of cases. But then, leading up to September 2023, her mental state began deteriorating again. She told psychiatrists that her mental health started worsening in the month before Annabel's death. On August 16, 2023, she had a consultation with her GP where they discussed attempting to conceive a second child. But behind the scenes, Alice was experiencing anxiety and distress. The crucial point here, Alice lacked insight into the severity of her condition. She knew something was wrong. She didn't know how bad it was. She attributed her symptoms to anxiety rather than recognizing them as signs of serious psychiatric illness. The lack of insight is itself a symptom of mental disorder. But now we come to the day that changed everything. September 10th, 2023 was a Sunday. At some point in the afternoon, in a state of psychotic delusion, Alice took Annabel to the Kingsley Pond I mentioned earlier and left her in the pond. The last evidence of Annabel being alive was at 4:15 p.m. There was a baby camera in Annabel's room that streamed to Alice's mobile, and an image from the time showed Annabel sitting in her cot, wearing the clothes in which she would later be found. Around 5 p.m., Alice contacted the police to report Annabel was missing, but what she told them wasn't true. She claimed she had put Annabel to bed around 3:45 p.m. and had returned to her bedroom about an hour later to discover Annabel wasn't there. She said she had left the front door open because of the hot weather and had been watching television downstairs. None of this was accurate because there is no hot weather in England. As the call progressed, Alice told the operator that she had gone outside and couldn't see her daughter, and she was walking to the pond and that she had found Annabel in the pond. She suggested someone must have entered the house and taken Annabel. Again, this wasn't true. The police arrived within 15 minutes. They found Annabel next to the pond and immediately began CPR. Paramedics arrived and were able to get a pulse. She was rushed to Southampton General Hospital, where doctors fought to save her life. But the damage? It was done. She was confirmed dead Monday, September 11th, 2023. After the police arrived at the scene, Alice called her mother and told her that Annabel had drowned in the pond. When her mother arrived, Alice repeated the claim someone must have entered the property and taken Annabel, saying Annabel was unable to get out of her cot on her own. She also told police she found Annabel inside the water and had gone to get her. Now, the post mortem examination conducted by forensic pathologist Dr. Delaney concluded that the clinical and post mortem findings were consistent with death arising from hypoischemic damage to the brain. Now, while Delaney couldn't make a confident diagnosis that these changes were specifically due to drowning, it was agreed that the court should proceed on the basis Alice was the one who put her child in the pond, causing these injuries, and left her there. So Alice was arrested on suspicion of murder. During police questioning, she answered no comment to all questions. However, when she was first produced in Crown Court, her legal representatives indicated she accepted she had caused the death. Following her arrest, Alice was once again seen by a psychiatrist. Again, she was detained under the Mental Health Act. The key to understanding this case lies in the psychiatric evaluations that followed. Two expert psychiatrists examined Alice and reviewed all the evidence. Professor Don Grubin, the Crown's expert in forensic psychiatry, concluded that at the time of the offense, Alice was suffering from mental or behavioral disorders associated with pregnancy. He explained this disorder had developed in the aftermath of Annabel's birth, but never fully resolved despite treatment. Now, with Alice's symptoms intensifying in the days before this murder, Professor Grubin's opinion was that this medical condition substantially impaired Alice's ability to form a rational judgment and provided an explanation for the murder. He stated, "I have considered the possibility Alice could have taken her daughter's life in a calculated, planned manner. In my opinion, however, this is highly unlikely. She is not antisocial or psychopathic in nature, which would be expected if this was the case, and she has no history or behaviors that might suggest she was. In other words, it was the birth that triggered this behavior." Now, Dr. Phil Hopley, the expert instructed by the defense, reached similar conclusions, identifying the condition as a form of postpartum psychotic depression. While the two experts differed slightly on diagnostic specifics, they agreed on the fundamental point. At the time Alice took Annabel's life, her ability to form a rational judgment was substantially impaired by her mental illness. The psychiatric evidence revealed something deeply tragic. Alice took Annabel's life based on a delusional belief that the best way to protect her daughter was to take her life, protect her daughter from her mother. She knew something was wrong, so she took her daughter's life to ensure she wouldn't punish her daughter further, if that makes sense. Alice wrongly believed Annabel was not flourishing under her care and was suffering. In her severely disordered mind, death was somehow an act of mercy. Now, on July 28, 2025, Alice Mackey appeared in court and pleaded not guilty, but guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. This plea meant that while Alice accepted she did this to Annabel, her mental illness had substantially impaired her ability to understand the nature of her conduct, to form a rational judgment, or to exercise self-control. The prosecution accepted this plea. This is significant because it means that after reviewing all the psychiatric evidence, the Crown was satisfied Alice's mental illness met the legal threshold. So, October 26, 2025, Alistair appeared at Winchester Crown Court for sentencing. The judge heard victim impact statements from Peter McKee, Annabel's father, and from other family members. Justice Saini described their loss as unimaginable and acknowledged that nothing would ever be same for them again. The judge had to work through a complex sentencing guideline for manslaughter by diminished responsibility. Now, the first step was to determine the degree of Alice's responsibility, how much control and judgment she retained. The judge reviewed all the evidence and reached several important conclusions. He found Alice had been severely mentally unwell since the birth. He found that her normal level of mental functioning after her treatment was substantially below what had been before Annabel was born, and he found that while the intensity varied, the mental illness Alice suffered in the first 18 months of Annabel's life was the same illness that affected her the day Annabel died. Alice never fully recovered. The judge noted the evidence showed Alice's continual mental impairment, and it was apparent to everyone, including her husband, her mother, and her colleagues. The judge found it particularly significant that there was such a marked contrast between Alice's highly successful teaching career before Annabel was born and then diminished after Annabel was born. He stated, "It's clear to me that something profoundly negative had happened to her mental health following Annabel's birth." The judge also found that the severe mental breakdown back in 2023 had been developing for weeks, possibly longer, and that Alice lacked insight into the extent of her mental illness, attributing her symptoms to anxiety, rather than recognizing them as the signs of serious psychiatric disorder. The judge also rejected the Crown's submission Alice failed to comply with medical advice, finding instead she had been compliant with her medication and had approached her medical regimen responsibly. Ultimately, the judge concluded Alice's level of retained responsibility was at the lower level. For this level, the sentencing guideline provides a starting point of 7 years custody, with a range of 3 to 12 years. The judge then considered other aggravating factors. First, Annabel's vulnerability due to her age. Second, the way in which her life was taken, being left in a pond. And third, the abuse of trust. Though this was closely related to Annabel's vulnerability as Alice's young child, notably, the judge did not treat Alice's lies to police as an aggravating factor, because he considered them an aspect of her delusional state. There were also substantial factors reducing seriousness and reflecting personal mitigation. Alice had no previous convictions and a positive character. The judge accepted her remorse as genuine. He acknowledged that in her delusional state, Alice had considered this some form of act of mercy towards Annabel. And that's a really weird way to look at it. Again, she thought Annabel was having a bad life, so she showered mercy on her by taking it. In this time, the judge noted Alice had made good progress in prison. Taking all these factors into account, he determined that before considering Alice's guilty plea, a sentence of 6 years imprisonment would have been appropriate. Because Alice had pleaded guilty at the earliest stage, after the medical evidence was available, she was entitled to a 1/3 reduction in sentence. In other words, he gave her a discount. On October 6, 2025, Alice Mackey was sentenced to 4 years in prison. She must serve 2/3 of this term before she may apply for parole, and when released, she would be on license for the remaining part of the custodial term. The judge called this a tragic case and noted it was far from straightforward in terms of determining a sentence. He emphasized, although there was a substantial mental health aspect of the case, what must not be lost is the fact that Alice did this. She took Annabel to the pond and left her there. And as I said in the beginning, we are expecting twins. I think they're going to be here at the end of November. But I've already been thinking about the next 2 to 3 months after that, keeping our family unit together, using the support system that we have to ensure there's a healthy recovery. And in this case, the postpartum is not an excuse, it's context, which is why she still was sentenced, but with a huge reduction, because a lot of it was not her fault. What makes this case particularly tragic, Alice was not someone who neglected her child. She did seek help. Her husband did act. She was hospitalized. She took medication. She engaged with mental health services, and yet her illness persisted. That led to catastrophic consequences. Postpartum is a serious condition, requires urgent medical attention. Delusions, hallucinations, severe mood swings, confused thinking, all of these are symptoms of the psychosis. Thinking their baby is in danger, sometimes to them, harming the baby is doing more good. And Annabel, she was 2 years and 8 months old when she died. She was a delightful child, loved by her family, with her whole life ahead of her. Her death is a tragedy. Peter lost his daughter, and in a different way, he's lost his wife. Annabel's grandparents lost their granddaughter, Her aunt lost her niece. A tragic case, but one I think had the right conclusion. Let me know what you think. I'm going to move on to my next story. Now, I'm going to look at a case and it highlights how a single mother of poor judgment can lead to absolutely devastating consequences. This is the story of Morgan Kiely, again from England. She was 19 years old. This story involves the tragic death of her son, Harry Kiely, in July 2022. Now, July 13th, 2022 was a hot summer day in Clacton-on-Sea. Again, hot summer day in England doesn't happen often, but this place was a seaside town in Essex. Morgan, just 19 years old at the time, was spending the day with her friend Stevie Steele and Morgan's young son Harry. The day started ordinarily enough. Morgan and Harry met up with Stevie, and the three of them headed to Oldie in Clacton. Their shopping list was simple: 3 bottles of rosé wine. They were planning to spend the afternoon at the beach enjoying the summer weather. They travelled in Stevie's car with Harry secured in a child seat in the back. At this point, everything seemed normal. Morgan was a young mother, but by all accounts, she was a good one. She worked as a carer, looking after elderly, sick, and vulnerable people. Those who knew her described her as responsible and loving towards Harry. And after picking up the wine, the group headed to the beach. And that's kinda the theme of today's video. Alice was a good mother. Morgan seemed like a good mother. Decision making is everything. So for the next 3 hours, they're at the beach. And think about it: a sunny beach, a young child playing in the sand, two friends relaxing and enjoying each other's company. Harry wasn't in his stroller, he was running around so that the adults could enjoy his company, and they were drinking. Now, exactly how much Morgan and Stevie drank that afternoon isn't entirely clear. The evidence suggests it may have been 2 bottles of wine between them, though the court worked on the basis of back calculations from blood samples taken later that evening. What we do know is that both women had been drinking for several hours in the hot sun, and as the afternoon wore on, Stevie's ex-partner, Mitchell Bassett, encountered them on the beach, and this is where the first warning sign appeared. The first moment where things could have gone differently. Mitchell could see both women had been drinking. He later testified he didn't think they were drunk exactly, but they were tipsy and happy. He was concerned that he offered them both a ride home. Think about that for a moment. Someone who knew Stevie well enough to be her ex-partner looked at the situation and thought, these women shouldn't be driving, maybe I can help them. He was concerned Stevie would continue drinking, and when he asked them, can I give you a ride, they said no. And here's the crucial point: Morgan didn't insist. She didn't take Mitchell up on his offer. She didn't suggest alternative arrangements. According to the judge's remarks, alarm bells should have been ringing in Morgan's head at that point. She knew how much they both had to drink. She could have and should have accepted Mitchell's offer. So Morgan got into Stevie's car, knowing that Stevie's judgment was impaired by alcohol. Morgan's own judgment was also impaired. Harry's safety was Morgan's responsibility. It should have been, as the judge later said, her primary concern. The intended journey was short, just a mile to Morgan's house. Think about that. They had to drive from the beach to Morgan's nan's house, which is only a mile away. This should not have taken long at all. A few minutes, maybe 5 at most. But they never arrived. Now here's where we need to talk about the child seat. This is absolutely critical to understanding what happened next. Harry was not secured at all. The internal harness, the straps that should have held him safely in place, was not attached. He was essentially just sitting in the seat unsecured. But it gets worse. The child seat itself wasn't properly strapped into the car using the rear seat belt. Morgan had simply draped the seatbelt around the back of the child seat and plugged it in. It wasn't actually securing anything. It was just there, giving the appearance of safety without providing any actual protection. And I think in Morgan's head she was thinking, it's only a mile down the road, I cannot be bothered to do this. Now the court had to determine whether this was Morgan's usual practice or one-off failing. The judge, applying the criminal standard of proof, found that this was a one-off failing. He couldn't be certain. Morgan regularly failed to secure Harry properly. The evidence showed that Morgan normally travelled with Harry in her nan's car, where an ISOFIX base was permanently installed. Now, if you're not familiar with car seats, an ISOFIX base is a system that makes installing a child seat much easier, more secure, and you basically just click the seat into the base. It's designed to prevent exactly the kind of installation errors that happen on this day. So, you have Morgan impaired by alcohol in a car driven by Stevie, who was also impaired by alcohol, with Harry unsecured. Now, the accident happened probably 2 minutes or so after the car left its parking space on one of the roads perpendicular to the seafront. Now, they were almost at their nan's place, literally 2 minutes away. Then the car had an accident. Stevie lost concentration. The car hit a parked vehicle. Her speed wasn't excessive. This wasn't a high speed crash. But the geometry of the accident, the angle at which they hit this parked car, combined with the speed, caused something that doesn't happen often in these collisions. The car rolled over. Harry was unsecured in his car seat and was thrown out of the rear car window. He died instantly. Wow, that's insane. The judge made a point that I think is really important to understand. It could, of course, be said that you, Stevie, and Harry, he's speaking to Morgan, were unlucky. This was not an accident that was likely to happen. 99 times out of 100, the car would not have rolled over and Harry would have survived. Think about that. In most circumstances, even with all the failures that occurred that day, Harry most probably would have survived. The car might have just bumped the parked vehicle and stopped. It might have crashed but not rolled. Or it might have rolled, but Harry might have stayed in the car. But that's not what happened. The least likely event is the event that happened. Unusual circumstances do happen. Bad luck does happen. But this is the reason why we take precautions. It's precisely because one cannot assume luck will always turn out to be good. This is why we have child seats. This is why they have to be used properly. This is why we have laws against drunk driving, because we cannot predict what's going to happen next. We cannot rely on luck. That's why, as the judge noted, putting to one side Stevie's responsibility, a mother should not agree to travel with a drunk driver, and through fear, her judgment might be impaired. Alternative travel arrangements should have been made in advance. Morgan was charged with manslaughter by gross negligence. This is a specific type of manslaughter charge in English law. It's not about intending to take someone's life or causing harm, it's about negligence, basically being an idiot. It's below the standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise. It's not essentially criminal. And to prove the gross negligence, the prosecution had to establish several things. First, Morgan owed Harry a duty of care, which is obvious, that's his mum. Second, she breached that duty of care. Again, this is obvious because they were both drunk. Without installing the car seat properly, she got into a car with a driver she knew was drunk. And third, that this breach of duty caused Harry's death. 100%. He would not have flown out the window of the car if the seat was on properly, or if they hadn't been drinking, or if they just stayed the fuck home. So the case went to trial, and the jury heard all the evidence. They found Morgan guilty of manslaughter by gross negligence. The judge had to sentence her, and this is where things get interesting, because the judge had to balance a lot of different factors. What do you think her sentencing should have been? She didn't intend for this to happen, but she was drunk. Let me know. Now, the judge in this case applied the Sentencing Council's gross negligence manslaughter guideline. This guideline helps judges determine appropriate sentences. By categorizing cases based on culpability and harm, the judge placed Morgan's case in category D, the lowest culpability, for two main reasons. One, her negligent conduct was a lapse in her otherwise good standard of care. This wasn't a pattern of neglect. By all accounts, Morgan was a loving, attentive mother. She simply made a mistake. This was a single failure, a one-time catastrophic mistake. Second, her lack of maturity at the time. She was only 19, and while legally an adult, the judge recognized that she was still young, perhaps not fully equipped to make the kind of risk assessments that an older person may have made. For category D, gross negligence manslaughter, the starting point under the guidelines is 2 years custody. But the judge also had to consider aggravating factors, things that made the offense worse. In Morgan's case, these were alcohol that afternoon, which she knew would have impaired her judgment and her decision to travel with Stevie, knowing Stevie had been drinking. Morgan knew more or less how much Stevie had drunk. However, there was also very substantial mitigation factors that reduced her culpability. The judge had already taken into account her youth and relative immaturity when placing the case in Category D, but there was more. Morgan was a good mother to Harry, and that this was a single failure. She was a person of good character. She looked after elderly, sick, and vulnerable people. Harry's death had a devastating impact on Morgan. The judge noted that it might not be unfair to say Morgan hadn't publicly accepted both what she did and failed to do that day, but he could tell from her demeanor that she didn't seriously question the expert evidence in the case. She was shocked by it, but she understood the consequences. Now, the judge said something powerful. He said, "I do not doubt that this whole experience, starting 13th of July and not concluding until I finish these sentencing remarks, will never be forgotten by you." Balancing all the aggravating and mitigating features, the judge arrived at a sentence of 2 years custody, no prison time. Then he had to make another decision: should that sentence be immediate or suspended? See, the suspended sentence means the person doesn't go to prison immediately. Instead, the sentence hangs over them for a 2-year period, and if they're caught doing something wrong or breaking the law, then they might go to prison. If they commit another offense during this suspension period, then maybe they'll get some time in jail. The judge believed there was a realistic prospect of rehabilitation. Morgan wasn't a career criminal or someone with a dangerous pattern of behavior. This was a tragic mistake, not an indication of ongoing risk, and all those factors were discussed about her character, her youth, and otherwise good care of Harry. More importantly, Morgan had a 4-month-old baby at the time of sentencing. I mean, it gets worse when you think about it. Morgan, what the fuck were you doing? And this other baby made it more complicated, because if they sent her to prison, that would mean she's separating from the child. I mean, did Morgan pose a risk to the public or to her baby? The judge didn't think so. So, to conclude, he imposed a 2-year suspended sentence, and he warned Morgan that if she reoffended during the suspension period, the court could activate the suspended sentence in whole. So, to conclude on both cases, let's go over Morgan again. A silly cow who made a dumb decision. But I don't know how to act on this one, because it was a mistake. It was a genuine mistake, I believe so. But it wasn't just a mistake, it was the mistake. So to have no jail time, it's taking the piss if you ask me. 5 years in prison or something would make sense. As for the case of Alice, again, I don't think any of it was her fault. Postpartum is real. She had all the support she could get, and even then, it didn't work. So her time in prison makes sense. Comment, tell me what you think.